Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first in our series of webinars, which we are running throughout November and into early December. My name is Dave Hedges, and I lead the National Employment Tax Practice for Azets. I'm delighted to launch the series with our first event, which is called The Future of Flexible Working for Employers, and also to be joined by many of you on this fine sunny day. I would like also to welcome my co-presenter, Duncan Wise from Accountancy and Financial Recruitment Consultants Greenwell Gleeson. Duncan will discuss some of the changes he is seeing around work practices, and I will then follow up with some associated tax aspects. Good afternoon, Duncan. If we just move on to the second slide, please. We'll cover the items as set out on today's agenda. Our presentation will last for around 40 minutes or so, with a Q&A session to follow. I will ensure that you are away by 1 o'clock for lunch, of course. A couple of points as we go through the session. You will see on your screen that you have the facility to submit questions, and you are able to do this at any time. You do not need to wait to the end. So any questions that come up as we're going through, please do make them. Please do put them through. We will pick them up at the end, but it's good to get a flow of them as we're going through. We're also running a couple of polls. These are really to help gauge key areas of interest and concern. You'll be able to post your response using the control panel when the questions pop up, and we'll give you a bit of guidance on those when they come through. But they're very easy to use. Even I can manage them. So just to set some background before we push on, it's really the current health crisis which has forced many businesses to reappraise the way in which they operate. Restrictions on opening and change in travel patterns have impacted on the usual means by which businesses have really started to or continue to trade. Today, during the session, we're going to consider the impact of such changes. We are, as a business, we're seeing employees working from home for extended periods and travelling less. The longer term arrangements and the impact are uncertain, of course. We don't know what's going to happen going forward. My view, for what it's worth, is that as we return to normality, employees will start to work as they did before, but that employers and employees alike will start to assess the long-term benefits of the short-term changes that they have needed to impose. So we're going to see some change, and I suspect we're going to see a reversion back to somewhere where we were before, but with taking effect of the impact of the changes that we've had. So we're going to end up in that middle space somewhere, I believe. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you across now to Duncan to discuss some of the impacts of flexible working that his business, Greenwell Gleeson, is seeing. So over to you, Duncan.
Thank you, David. And I'll go off screen now and run through the presentation. Next slide, please. So today I'll be give you a little bit of our thoughts on the current market, what it is that Greenwell Gleeson do offer, running through some of the flexible working that we're seeing that clients are seeing, what clients are seeing, and then a little bit around the future. To reiterate David's point, we will include polls within the presentation, so it'd be great to see what you've got to say, again using the control panel on the pop-up screen. So, just a little bit of an intro. My name's Duncan Wise. Sorry, go back to the previous slide. I'm Duncan Wise. I've been with Greenwell Gleeson for 23 years, doing the business development for the last 4, and we're a West Midlands financial recruitment specialist, so covering national and international roles. What have we seen over the last 7.5, 8 months or so? I think the overriding feeling is, well, that could have been worse. And certainly for us, the recruitment wheel has kept. It's a little bit smaller, and turning a little slower, but suffice to say, accountants are very much a very much added value commodity at this point in time, and having a good direct controller or credit controller or purchase ledger clerk really add value to businesses, whether they're performing well, given the depending on the sector, or also just in the middle. Permanent recruitment market has definitely been much stronger. Where we thought there might be interim need, this has been fairly quiet over the last month or so, as CBILS and furlough have kept trouble at bay. This is confirmed by conversations that I've had with some of the major bankers and insurers and other accountancy firms, restructuring departments. For most businesses, it's as good as ever, as has been taken advantage of. Although this does mean that certainly for the finance teams, maybe some of those staff have been close to run ragged because they haven't had been working a lot harder than usual. Moving on to the next slide and what it is that we do. We are Birmingham's longest and established independent financial group, but we're not just a vanilla contingent relying on client-led opportunities. We are a proactive member of the wider business community and trusted businesses, and hence why we're here today, partnering and being able to give our thoughts on flexible working. We cover, as the slide suggests, all roles from executive permanent right the way through down actional, and all of those are available on and a temporary basis, be that day umbrella, PAYE or limited business, and obviously with the IR35 implications of next year, there's things that we're doing in the background to make sure that we're compliant on as well. And it's not just us that think we're okay. We've been voted by the interim professionals in the annual survey as the leading specialist financial recruiter in the UK in 2020 for the 9th successive year. So yeah, all aspects of the financial pyramid, top to bottom and back up again. Next slide. And poll question. As an employer, would you be offering your staff going forwards 100% working from home, 100% in the office, or a mix of working from both? The answers should be easy to see from your control panel. I know what the answer to this probably this time last year, but it'd be interesting to see where we are and thinking going forwards into 2021. Just give you a couple of seconds to tick a box. And that's pretty much what I would have expected, given the conversations I've had working over the last so, and be interesting to see what the answer to the next poll question will be when David puts his poll to the party as well. So yeah, a mix is generally what we're looking forward as well. So yeah, that very nicely helps me to move on to my next slide. So flexible, what does this mean for clients and employers? As per the results of the poll, offering a mix means that you will probably be able to attract candidates from further afield. you're not necessarily having to look to those that can sensibly commute within half an hour, 40 minutes of your office every day, which might therefore improve the caliber and quality of the finance team that you've got. Totally, we were looking to work with a business in Bristol, and coming from Birmingham, no candidate would probably travel from Birmingham to Bristol every day, but given the client only needed someone in the office a couple of days a week, then actually someone from here there only twice a week knows full well that they can be in their office the rest of the week. Also, when it comes to the caliber of candidate and the options and the flexibility, you might actually want to upscale the quality of you recruit, but maybe only have them on a part-time or a portfolio. Many SMEs often think that they can afford a finance director in the 80 to 100k bracket, but if you had someone like that on half the time or 3 days a week, that would be a 50 or 60k cost, which actually might be a lot more appealing and might be able to get you in and out of a situation that you find yourself in. So geography and cost are two things that clients will want to be able to think about. Moving on to candidates. Again, as per the civil working for clients, candidates again will consider wider geographical locations. They'll see the job and their skills might well be more in tune with what that business does, and as a consequence of working flexibly, they may equally be flexible on their salary expectations. If someone's expecting them to go to the office every day, there's the cost incurred of the wear and tear on the car, so they're going to need to be compensated. If, however, they're working from home, then they may want to be flexible on their salary expectations. Also, work flexibly means that you may well be able to work, again, maybe on a part-time or a flexible basis. Parents who have got childcare, school drop-off to consider as well. So there is a lot to be said, and thankfully the mix option does mean that you're not just necessarily having to replace like with like you might have had this time last year, might not be what you want now and forwards, which then leads us on to the next and final slide with the future. Working from home is great. Everybody's their boxes ticked and their work done, but what does it actually mean in culture and team working? I know a lot of people are using Zoom or Teams that actually beat bumping into someone at the water or coming out of the kitchen or just popping your head out of your door and seeing the whites of somebody's eyes and just grabbing their attention for 5-10 minutes. There is a lot more time in the day with not commuting at the moment. It seems to be taken up in hourly chunks of Teams or Zoom calls. So something that would take 5 minutes over a cup of coffee is now taking an hour over a Teams or Zoom's call. Leading on to that, obviously then you've got to think about staff promotions and how do you get develop your staff to be able to take the next step up. So I think the conclusion that we come to, which that the poll showed, is a little bit of everything in moderation will do everybody good. Team culture will remain, staff development is possible, and the business can grow and develop and get back to or develop a new flexible agile way of working, and hopefully we'll see the back of 2020 and 2021 will be a new year. If there are any questions, David will answer those at the end. And yeah, thank you very much for your time, and I'll pass it back to David.
Great, thank you very much, Duncan. It's interesting that before I launch into what I was going to say, and I've got a few things to say around related tax issues. The two words that came immediately to mind there that sort of jarred in my mind that Duncan said were geography and cost. And I guess the first thing for me as an employee would be, do I want to continue to travel long distance? It's a question. It's a going forward question, particularly when I can sit in the comfort of my own house and use Zoom or Teams. Related to that, does my employer actually want me to travel as much? Because it's actually time inefficient and it's expensive as well. Now, against that, we have got the lack of people contact, the water cooler moment that Duncan mentioned there. So there's a fine balance here, I think, between the different way of working that we're seeing at the moment and its effectively its longevity, really. And I suspect, as I said earlier, that we're going to end up somewhere back in the middle. But thank you very much, Duncan. I'm going to discuss a number of tax-related issues. The flexibility over workforce availability and the change in working patterns, which Duncan has covered, brings with it quite a lot of tax considerations. Actually, some are immediate, but the current health crisis has, for some businesses, accelerated changes, which now mean that we've got to think about some tax issues sooner rather than later. Now, before we do that, we are going to launch into our second poll. So we'll have a look at that now. The poll question here is actually remarkably similar to the one that you've already dealt with, but we're actually now looking at it from the employee's perspective. If I can ask you to go for your buttons on these questions. Interested here to understand the different approach really from the employee's perspective. We saw that the employer was actually very keen to look at embracing a mixture of both working from home and working from the office. 87%, overwhelming. It'll be interesting to see if the employee's view is the same, bearing in mind they might like a bit more control over what they're doing, but on the other hand, they might like to still keep mixing with people and talking to people as well. So that result should be through shortly, and we'll have a look at that. Once we've done that, then we'll look at some of the issues and start actually on working from home. But let's just wait for the result of the poll to come through. Okay, all right. So what we're seeing there is it's pretty similar actually. Although actually we've got more people wanting to work at home than the employer wanted to work at home, which is interesting. That's 4% gone up to 14. Work in the office has gone from 9, but it's gone down to 6. So employees not showing as much of an appetite to work in the office as perhaps employers are wanting them to be in the office. And the mix is 80%. So clearly there is an appetite for people to work from home, which leads me nicely into the start of the tax issues that we're going to have a look at. And I look at some working from home issues. I think the most obvious change, of course, really, is that for many of us, going to the usual place of work is no longer normal or indeed usual. Everything has changed. Whether furloughed or not, many of us are now working from the kitchen table, or as I am today, from the spare bedroom. Aside from the obvious lack of interaction with colleagues, Teams calls are great, but they do not substitute for actually meeting people. There are some tax considerations we've got to think about. I'm going to talk about the concept of a permanent workplace shortly, but suffice it to say, your home has probably not become one simply because you've been constantly there for the last 6 months, and perhaps you may be there for a few more. Generally, for a workplace to be a permanent one, it needs to be the place where you're expected to be and from which you carry out the bulk of your duties. These are referred to as substantive duties, and there should really be an objective requirement for you to work in the place that your employer is asking you to work. And will not cover temporary changes in location. Now, that said, as employers, you are able to provide some support for those working at home without adverse tax impacts. And there are a few of these things. You may provide equipment to allow employees to do their job. So IT equipment, printers, headphones, and that's certainly been something that my business has done for its employees working from home. And this may extend to other pieces of kit, for example, a desk or a chair. As an employee, you can also do this where the kit is provided as an employer, you would generally do this on the basis that the kit is provided for business use. And generally speaking, the stipulation is that any private use should be incidental. Now, when we get to the end of the crisis, there is another thing that we do need to think about, and that's what happens to the equipment. If the employee is allowed to keep it, so it's transferred effectively to the employee, there will be a tax charge on transfer. Now, it's generally fair to say that the types of items that we're talking about do depreciate pretty quickly, and therefore the tax charge may be quite small, but there is potentially a tax charge on the transfer of kit back, transfer of kit to an employee if the employer decides, for whatever reason, he doesn't want it. The other side of that, of course, is the employer may ask for it back, but he may not want an extra 100 or 200 chairs or laptops in his office. So there's a balancing act that we need to think about there. The other issue around working from home is, of course, the additional costs that the employee incurs, and typically that will be around heating, lighting, electricity, that type of thing. Additional costs as a result of working from home can be reimbursed, but it may be easier for you as an employer to actually think about paying the HMRC, HM Revenue and Customs approved weekly sum to cover such aspects. That is currently £6 per week. Now, if you choose not to do that, the employee can still make a claim to HMRC for tax relief on the home costs that he incurs, and that's an easily done thing as well. That can be done at the end of the year through self-assessment. So let's now have a look at some aspects around travel patterns, if we may. So we're seeing a significant reduction in employee travel costs across a range of businesses. Now, from a business perspective, that's great because the costs are reducing. But from a commercial perspective, that cannot be so good. Changing the way of working may change the nature of the workplace for tax purposes. And what I want to do is just spend a few minutes considering two terms which come up time and time again when we're speaking to the tax authorities, and certainly when tax authorities undertake their own employment taxes reviews. And those two terms are the concepts of a permanent workplace and the concept of a temporary workplace. We'll just have a look at those in a little more depth. They're sharply, if we can just go back a slide, please. Thank you. They're sharply in focus as a lot of us have shifted our routines and now spend different amounts of time in places that we had not done so before. So let's just think about what is a business journey for this purpose. Essentially, a business journey is a trip to a place other than that where you are normally expected to be found and carry out your usual work. That's what's generally referred to as a permanent workplace, and in most cases it will be quite obvious what your permanent workplace is. At the other end of the spectrum, we have a temporary workplace. Think of this as somewhere you would go, or an employee would go, non-routinely or irregularly to carry out a one-off or so-called self-contained task. Now, the distinction between permanent and temporary is important because travel costs to a temporary workplace, together with any associated subsistence or accommodation costs, perhaps if there's an overnight stay required, may be paid by an employer tax-free. However, if the destination is a permanent workplace, any such costs borne by the employer are taxable. And that's why it's important. If we've got a shift in the way that people are working, then actually what we may have here is a shift between what we thought was a temporary workplace, and it may actually start to evolve into a permanent one. And then the tax position in respect to expenses paid will change as well. So let's just have a look at the nature of the workplace. So in the context of the current crisis, there may be some temptation to consider that the position has changed or at the very least become blurred. The fact that I'm now regularly working from home does not actually mean that home is a permanent workplace for me. Equally, the fact that I've rarely visited my office over the last 7 months, I think I've been there about 3 times, does not make that a temporary workplace, such that I may claim my travel costs to and from that office from my employer on a tax-free basis. That said, there are undoubtedly businesses we will be examining working arrangements. Perhaps the last few months have confirmed the business can operate without a head office, for example, and that it will embrace more agile working. If there is no office to go to, then it may be more likely the employee is required to carry out substantive duties from home and nowhere else. So perhaps the home does start to look a bit more like a permanent workplace. So it could be that the nature of the workplace will change. For tax purposes, however, I can't emphasize enough, this does need to be reviewed very precisely to ensure the business is not unwittingly paying travel-related costs tax-free when they should be taxed. And I would add on to that it's important to keep an ongoing review, and certainly across the employee group, we need to look at differences, because some employees will be more likely to change their permanent workplace, some may not. So it needs to be looked at on an employee by employee basis. So let's just extend that a bit and then think about some businesses that have what I call multi-site businesses, multi-site employers. So if we'll have a look at that now, where this is in point, the situation does become more complex, where we've got employees who are crisscrossing all over the place and frequently traveling between different work sites. Now, in the current economic climate, it could be, for example, that businesses are laying off employees, and that a consequence of that we've seen is that those remaining are being required to change their work patterns, spend more time than before at different work locations, and that's just to effectively just to fill the gaps that are left by those employees who have departed. Now, where this is the case, we need to be certain that any travel costs paid do not become taxable as a result of the location travelled to becoming a permanent workplace. We therefore need to marry any potential savings arising from staff reductions with any potential tax costs that may arise as a result of people travelling more. The key takeaway here is that travel to a permanent workplace is taxable, where the employer bears the cost of it. Travel to a temporary workplace is not. And the tax rules around that distinction are complex and can catch the unwary employer. As such, we need to be sure of the tax status of the employee's workplace. Sometimes it will be clear, sometimes it will be less so. Generally speaking, if we've got a change in travel patterns, a change in locations where employees are starting to work, the current position should be reviewed so that we can examine the correct and identify and make sure that we are applying the correct tax treatment. Now, there is actually some impact as well for company vehicles. So we'll just have a brief look at the potential impact there. So we're going to split this into two aspects, actually three. We look at company vans, we look at cars, and we look at briefly at some related fuel issues. So a company provided van to start with. Now, a company provided van does not attract a benefit in kind, provided it is only used for business purposes. And in this context, insignificant business use can be disregarded. And insignificant private use can be disregarded. I think I may have said business use, but insignificant private use can be disregarded. And in that context, travel to and from work, the occasional trip to the tip to drop off something can be disregarded as incidental. However, it is important to keep records to prove there has been no private mileage other than that defined as insignificant. Now that's a key factor. I was talking to a client yesterday, and they've been returning vans on P11Ds for years actually. And actually, all they do is give people vans that they use in their business, and they take them home and they don't use them. They're not really suitable to be used for any other use, anything privately. So we're talking to them about, well, because they are only used for business purposes, there actually is a possibility that you can actually not seek to put those on P11Ds or for the employees to be taxed on the provision of those vans. So vans are great, but we do need to keep a record really to ensure that any private use is insignificant in terms defined by HMRC. And clearly, if you are a business with a fleet of vans, that's worth looking at, but we do need to have the records to support it. So vans really taxed on, we look at the actual use of the van. Now, cars, on the other hand, are treated as benefits where they are available for private use, whether or not so used. So on the one hand, for vans, it's actual use, and for company cars, it's availability for use, availability for private use. Now, it has been possible to take some cars out of charge during the pandemic, but this hasn't been straightforward. And if you do need any more information around that, please do get in touch with me. Typically, that would have been where the car was made unavailable because the employee was not able to drive or not allowed to drive during the period during the crisis. Now, if we just have a look at fuel, there is potential risk around fuel where this is provided to company car drivers. Many company car drivers avoid a car fuel benefit charge by paying back to the company the private fuel element initially paid for by the company. And this is absolutely the correct mechanism where the private fuel element is low. Paying this back is cheaper than the much higher tax bill on the car fuel benefit that would otherwise arise. However, this does require the full cost of the private fuel being repaid by the employee. It's what we call an all or nothing charge. So if there is £1 of private fuel that has not been repaid, the full car fuel benefit charge applies. Now, if we just link that back to this earlier distinction between permanent and temporary workplaces, if a temporary workplace or a workplace that we think is temporary is actually a permanent one, this will mean that travel to that place is actually not business mileage at all, but actually it should be redesignated as private mileage. Now, that would then mean that on the basis that this has not been repaid, this additional private mileage element has not been repaid by the employee to the employer, the car fuel benefit charge will kick in. And this will be expensive, and the cost will fall on the employer on the basis that he has failed to return a benefit in kind on the annually to the revenue on form P11D. So we need to be very careful where we are making a decision on the nature of an employee's workplace, because if we get it wrong, then there is a risk that actually we can inadvertently walk into car fuel benefit charges. Now, the reason this is important is because I mentioned that there is an all or nothing charge point here, but the other relevant point here is that the car fuel benefit is simply very, very high and very expensive, and typically that could result in a tax bill of between £2,000 and £3,000 per employee. Now, bearing in mind, if a business has got a lot of employees where they've incorrectly categorised the workplaces, and they've got quite a few cars, that can come to a big annual number. And bear in mind, if that's picked up by the tax authorities, then actually there's more than a 1 year carryback. So in the current circumstances, we do need to be very careful if we are making decisions about considering changing our expenses policies, and on the basis that we think that the workplace has changed. So just a brief word also, just on this slide, about electric cars. Salary sacrifice arrangements remain attractive for electric cars, and equally benefit and kind rates are very low. Now, excuse me, 0% for an electric car provided now by an employer in the current tax year, rising to 1% next year and locked in at 2% for the following tax year. We've also got very much lower rates for hybrids, where the CO2 emissions between 0 and 50 grams per kilometre, and those rates are dependent on the electric range of the vehicle in point. So there are advantages to thinking about looking at different types of cars, and my own view is that actually electric cars may start to become more attractive if employees are travelling less. So the range becomes less in point. I'd just like a final word, if I may, about engaging workers off payroll. We're seeing a number of businesses really consider their worker engagement model. Typically, this will be consideration over whether employees are going to be required on the same basis as before. Now, whilst employers may reduce numbers or change employee terms and conditions, a further consideration may be to engage them off payroll on a self-employed consultancy basis. Now, it's attractive, of course, because the employer is no longer required to operate PAYE and does not have the ongoing employer national insurance cost. That is where the individuals are genuinely self-employed. But as I say, I think this is an area that is really very tricky, very tricky, and there are lots of things to consider. A few things come immediately to mind. As a business, have you previously engaged the individuals as employees? If so, what has changed that makes them look a bit more like they are genuinely self-employed now? Are they working alongside employees in your business who are doing a similar job? And put simply, are they genuinely self-employed when we consider the key distinguishing factors? Is the individual genuinely his or her own account? Does he or she display the traits that we would normally put to self-employment? Now, it's important because the onus is very much on the engager to be certain. If there is any PAYE failure, any claim will be against the engager. Excuse me. Now, tempting though it is to reduce costs in this way, it is very difficult for businesses to revert to a self-employed model where the role has not, in essence, changed. So extreme care is needed. And finally, just a quick word about IR35. The rules are changing from next April for medium and large businesses to engage individuals through intermediaries. Essentially, the onus will be on the end user of an individual services where they are provided via a personal service company or an employment intermediary to consider the employment status of the individual from a tax perspective. So if you do have individuals that you are engaging through personal service companies now, and you're engaging with them directly, you will have to you will have to test the position, and you will also have to apply appropriate deduction of PAYE if they do look like employees. So it's a go forward point. We will be talking about this much more as we go into January, and we will be running a number of seminars around this subject as we get through to the changes from next April. So watch this space for now, really. Okay. So thank you. That's the end of the formal part of the session. It leaves me now to say thank you very much for your attendance today, and probably very importantly as well, very many thanks to Duncan for his contribution today. If we do have any further questions, we will make sure that we deal with them, and we'll be in touch with you if you have asked a question that we've not managed to get to today. But just easily to say thank you very much for listening in, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.